Yeah. So a bunch of this stuff was already mentioned by Ryan in his news go through, because a lot of this is just bullet points of news and then little bits and pieces that I learned here and there from build and stuff. And it was awesome to see the live player demo because I have no way of doing that because I do not own any iOS or Android devices. So I haven't actually been able to try that myself at all. So that was cool. To start off, I just got a few photos I took from build. So keynotes, a bunch of stuff about cognitive services. Some of those demos were pretty awesome. There's a whole bunch of cognitive services that you could theoretically use in your mobile apps if you wanted to. Things where they were able to just like, it was detecting like the jackhammer was vertical instead of on the floor, and it's like that the person that programmed their app to be like, no, if you see a jackhammer that's vertical, that's not safe, and send a notification to the supervisor so they can go and put it down flat. It's just crazy awesome stuff like that. I'm going to talk a bit about .NET Standard because that is of particular interest to me, and I wanted to do a session about that anyway before I went to build, so I've put that in as well. I got to see and touch a Surface laptop. They're coming out soon. Yes, they are actually fabric. That is actually a fabric keyboard. Yeah. I mean, it's like a Surface Pro type cover, with the difference being that you can't pull that type cover off and replace it if it's gets a bit dirty. But it's an awesome thin laptop. So, but yeah, I got to see one of they're pretty much outside of build. They pretty much don't have a lot around at the moment because they're still in pre-production or whatever. But that was cool to see that. They have an area called the Hub. There's all these booths and stuff. The Xamarin people were there, so I got to speak to people like James Montemagno and such like that. There was a session about fluent design, which I'll briefly touch on, and just cool little exhibits here and there. So here's a bunch of stuff. So again, Ryan mentioned some of it already. So Visual Studio for Mac went RTM. Some people described it as Xamarin Studio rebranded. That's not entirely fair. I would describe it as we have the last version of Xamarin Studio, they've got a 6.3. There's actually a thing on the website saying that they're not going to make any more after 6.3. I'd describe it as Xamarin Studio 7 rebranded. There is a heap of new stuff in there that's it. It's not just a rebrand. There's a lot more to it than that. I'm going to talk about .NET Standard 2 soon. XAML Standard 1, now that got a huge applause in the audience. One of the biggest applauses of the couple of days. I'll talk about that. They've got a GitHub page, and they're actually asking for feedback right now. So these are the 8 different items at the moment that they're looking for feedback on. But essentially, it is the unification of Xamarin Forms XAML and UWP XAML. Somebody asked about WPF, and they said no, they're going to leave WPF as it is for now because it's more complicated to change that. So just UWP and Xamarin Forms XAML. It was interesting at the Xamarin Forms discussion with David and Jason. Some people asked around, so which is it going to be more like? Is UWP going to become more like Xamarin Forms, or is Xamarin Forms going to become like UWP? And at this point, they're looking for feedback. They don't have a opinion either way. He kind of made it clear which way he would prefer, but that was just his thoughts. He does work on the Xamarin Forms team, so. Though the message that kept making clear at this time was, we do not want to break people who are currently using either of those platforms at the moment. So I think at least for the short term, no breaking changes is. So they may for a while keep both like an old and new around, is what seemed to be the subtle messaging. although I was at a session that Kevin Gallo, yeah, that's his name, I think. He did seem to indicate that in the near that in the long term that there would probably have to be breaking changes at some point. But he essentially described it as we had two divergent things, and we either had to let them go on forever and continue to be divergent, or we had to say, yeah, we need to at this point start to bring them together, and there may be changes. But at this point, the messaging they've been saying is it's going to stay as backwards compatible as possible for now, which is awesome. On the Windows side, there's a feature coming called timelines, and the whole idea around this is that Microsoft wants to make your iOS and your Android devices work very well with your Windows device. So they want Windows to make your iOS and Android experiences great in terms of you as developers can use things like the Project Rome SDKs, which they announced, to write to what they call the Microsoft Graph. They've added these capabilities called devices and activities to the Microsoft Graph, and they're accessible through the Project Rome APIs. And what that means is that you'll be able to, if you want, write in your apps experiences and such that on the devices, in your iOS and Android devices, that get reflected back to your Windows device, like the pick up, pick off type scenarios. They used examples like you were filling something in on one device and you come back and it's there on your Windows device. You can continue it and vice versa, and things like a universal clipboard and all that. They want to make these devices you can just pick them up as appropriate and use them, and you have, as developers, have the ability to do some of this in your own apps now through the Project Rome SDK. On the GitHub page, it says it's available for Xamarin.Android, but it doesn't look like it's available for iOS iOS Xamarin at the moment. So, but there's definitely native iOS there at the moment. So I'm sure it's all in preview, but it looked pretty awesome. And I as a Windows user, I'm quite keen to see this cross-platform. They described at the end of the platform wars is how they described it. So that was pretty awesome. Yeah, that seems to be the thing. Yeah, it all connects to what they call the Microsoft Graph. And there's like a feature coming to Windows where it's like a timeline. So it looked a little bit like Time Machine on a Mac, except instead of being a display of backups of files, it was like what you've been doing. Like you went to your thing and it's like, oh, you had this app open like earlier this afternoon and you had this thing and it's like a little card showing you. Like, oh, cool. That's pretty cool. That's pretty awesome. They announced the Fluent design language. So one of the things that back in the Windows Phone days was there was a very clear design language. There was patterns, there was principles, there was rules and stuff. When Windows 10 came along, some of those patterns and rules probably weren't quite as defined. They've got a very good set of materials, guidelines, resources around designing apps now that Microsoft is going to follow for their apps. And if you want to build UWP apps, a lot of the principles they brought in were from HoloLens. So they've got this whole thing about, and I can actually show you one of the slides. I think they briefly mentioned it in here. They talked about how the playground is expanding and how, like, we've got these screenless devices where we have like voice and stuff as a interaction. We've got little screens, we've got big screens, we've got 3D, etc., etc. And just zoom that out again. And they want to try and build some of the UI guidelines that would that fit around those different types of devices. So the Fluent stuff is also stuff they want feedback on. There's a LinkedIn group where they're discussing this right now, and they're keen for your feedback. They described it as a journey that they're working on. There's elements that you'll see now and available in the SDK they're going to keep going throughout the future, and it looked quite nice. They're going to later this year add UWP support to the Visual Studio Mobile Center, which is a replacement for Hockey app in terms of the distribution aspect. The Xamarin Test Cloud stuff's being brought in there. So there'll be Windows devices you can use in there as well. So that's awesome. Xamarin Live Player, that's been well covered. So that was the stuff in the keynotes. Then there was a session with Miguel de Casa and James Montemagno. And they announced, again, some of this stuff is what Ryan talked about, but they talked about the fact that there's a CocoaPods importer now. So if you do native iOS development, you probably use CocoaPods. It's a way to bring that stuff in, be able to use it in Xamarin. They talked about something called Swift Netifier, and it's what I gathered it being is that there's Java binding projects and Objective-C binding projects, and they're good. Sometimes you have to do a bit of work because those languages apparently don't quite have all the descriptions and attributes. Sometimes you have to do some work to map those to C#. They describe Swift as pretty much having most of that, so they can programmatically do most of that, if not all of it for you. So it seems to be a you'll be able to use Swift libraries with your Xamarin with very little effort on your part. You just run it through a thing, and bam, you can use your Swift libraries in C#. The Xamarin linker is better when you're using this. Ryan mentioned this, but if you've got extensions for your iOS projects, the slide that I looked at, basically it had a main Xamarin iOS project, an extension project, and then under it had Xamarin Xamarin runtime, and essentially the two boxes disappeared. So there was one Xamarin runtime across all three, which is instead of having three copies, which is okay, that makes sense. The next one, they demoed this. Now, this was already in Xamarin Studio 6.3 and Visual Studio for Mac, so you can already use this. But this was pretty much my job for about a year or two, and that was managing configuration and provisioning profiles on iOS. They basically have got rid of the need for me to manage all that manually now. You don't have to log into the Apple portals at all anymore. You can just go into Xamarin and you'd be like, I need a provisioning profile and a certificate, and it's like, cool, I'll make you one, and done. That's pretty much how they demoed it, which is awesome because I literally wrote pages of documentation about how this works because it's complicated. So that's so awesome. There's the SDK manager inside Visual Studio for Mac. So that's good. I think I kind of read somewhere that Google's starting to phase out the GUI for that because they want you to use the Xamarin, the Android Studio. So that's one of the reasons why Xamarin built theirs in, because they went, well, we don't want you installing Android Studio just to manage your SDKs. We'll look after that for you as well. They talked about a material designer, which generates Android theme code and stuff, so you don't have to go look up that stuff on the internet, and it looked pretty awesome. Ahead of time compilation for Android and Mac OS. So the way Xamarin works is on iOS you have to ahead of time compile everything, because you're not allowed to use just-in-time compiling on iOS. It's just not allowed, so you've had to ahead of time compile stuff. On Android, however, in the past, it was all just in time. So two very different ways of compiling apps. Android now supports some ahead of time compiling, and so now Xamarin can support that, and it means that it's faster and smaller and more optimized. Is the way they described it. But they have a hybrid mode for if you want to take it, because just-in-time compiling gives you some additional advanced features if you know how to use them. I do not, but I know that people do. So it allows you to kind of get the best of both worlds. For that preview now, they basically had to enable it through like flags in configuration files. So I'm sure there'll be a GUI at some point. And the Embedded Native 4000, which they said, yeah, marketing hasn't approved this name. They described it. I think it's also partly a community-based thing as well. But it was a fun joke, that the name. Yeah, use your .NET code native, so you can write .NET libraries and then give them to your colleagues who have to do native development, which is good. That's actually pretty good for governments who may have developed iOS and Android apps in the past on native platforms, but they may have business logic that's in .NET. They can kind of just grab those bits out and give it straight to their native developers. That's awesome. And then I went to the Xamarin Forms talk, which was good, which was David and Jason. .NET Xamarin Forms 2.3.5 is now available. .NET Standard compatible, which is awesome. I really like .NET Standard, as I'll talk about soon. They've got some of the performance improvements for Android in there already. The macOS support, which Glenn demoed 2 meetups ago, so that's in there if you want it. And then there's Xamarin Forms 3, and they were very clear to describe that the Xamarin Forms 3, you will not see all of this in the first version. This is going to be through the life cycle. So if you get Xamarin Forms 3 and you're like, where's all this stuff I was promised? It's coming throughout the life cycle of it, they said. Flexbox type things through a flex layout. So if you're a CSS person and you like to develop screens using Flexbox style thing, you'll be able to use that. List view improvements. You won't have to use cells anymore if you use list views, which was that people were interested in that. They're bringing some of the UWP things like visual state managers, a better adaptive layout type thing, some XAML improvements, one-time binding and stuff. The Xamarin Forms embedding, which was talked about, and they kind of sold that a little bit as if you have done a Xamarin Forms project in the past and you realize that you need to do native Xamarin, this is a way that you could kind of do file new project, native Xamarin, and then bit by bit bring across your Xamarin Forms pages to native if you wanted to do that. I know. So that's an interesting way, but there's heaps of other use cases for it other than that. It was mentioned that Xamarin Forms support's coming to lots more platforms: macOS, Linux, WPF, and Tizen. So if you want to run it on your Samsung fridge, it's possible. And then the last one, and this was a super maybe. They talked about it, but they've emphasized that it may not be possible to do this. That they may end up being able to do that Xamarin Forms embedding into native iOS projects as well. So if you have an existing Swift or Objective-C in a Java project, that they may be able to bring Xamarin Forms embedding to those as well. But that was definitely we'll see. We'd like your feedback, basically. I said, would this be of interest to you? So if it is, contact the team. So talked about Xamarin Live Player, so I can skip that. We're getting close to the end. .NET Standard. So this, I think, is awesome. We use PCLs where I am. PCLs are great, but they had some limitations. The way PCLs worked was you picked various platforms that you wanted to support. So Xamarin, maybe you wanted to support Windows Phone 8.0 Silverlight or 8.1 or various platforms. Silverlight theoretically, but you had to use the lowest common denominator. So the more platforms you added, the less APIs you had access to, especially if you added Windows Phone 8.0 Silverlight. That took a lot of APIs out because that's very old technology compared to Xamarin and UWP. If Microsoft added new platforms, which this happened when they added 8.1, if your libraries that you used, if the vendors didn't recompile it to support it, you couldn't use those in your PCLs. That was a bit of a problem. So, and it also meant that if there was just .NET Framework libraries that were never compiled for Xamarin. The developers never use it. You couldn't really use those in your PCLs because the whole referencing thing didn't work properly. So what they've done is they're replacing PCLs with .NET Standard. .NET Standard introduces APIs. So there's .NET Standard 1.0 up to 1.6 at the moment, and every version of it introduces new APIs. But newer versions often drop older platforms. So you can decide what the newest version of .NET Standard will work for you. But they're forwards compatible. So if I as a library vendor write a .NET Standard library and I target, say 1.4, people who use 2 can still use my library. I don't have to recompile, which means that I'm not keeping people behind by using PCL type stuff. And you can just, as you drop platforms, move up the newer versions. And this is the little chart that they've got on there. So for example, Windows Phone Silverlight, you really can only use .NET Standard 1. Whereas with Xamarin, if you're using the latest versions of Xamarin, you can use up to .NET Standard like 2 in preview and stuff like that. .NET Standard 2, huge number of APIs they're adding because they're taking what is with the .NET framework for Windows and Xamarin and the intersection of all those APIs, they're going to be. So that's a heck of a lot of APIs that you'll have access to. And at the same time, they're bringing .NET Core, which didn't have that many APIs, up to that same level of APIs. So those 3 platforms now will all have the same API support. Xamarin will obviously have its own stuff, Windows has its own stuff, and .NET Core will have its own stuff, but they will all support a minimum set of APIs that will allow interoperativity. So that's pretty awesome. They're also adding in this compatibility shim. So that whole issue about if somebody had never created a library which was supported by PCLs or by .NET Standard, if it doesn't target anything outside of .NET Standard, so if it doesn't target basically any Windows-specific stuff, you will be able to bring that library in and use it with your Xamarin stuff. So that is just, I think that's awesome. And then lastly, I talked about XAML Standard, but yeah, they're looking for feedback, so I'll skip that. There's a bunch of links to various projects and stuff, so you can read more about them. And yeah, that's it. So thank you. If you've got any questions, yeah, just let me know. Cool. I know I talked a bit, but.
Did they address the .NET Core and Stack Overflow during the development?
They did. I didn't go to the .NET ASP.NET stuff because I'm not in the web development stuff, but I think they did.
Okay, I'm just curious because I only saw the blog.
Yeah. Yeah. For anybody who's not aware of that, so on top of .NET Core, which is built on .NET Standard 1 at the moment, there's ASP.NET Core, which is a cross-platform version of the ASP framework. It's just like .NET Core. It's a very limited subset of the full ASP.NET Core. For 2.0, they're going to bring it up to .NET Standard 2, but they made an announcement, I think before build, that you wouldn't be able to run that on .NET Framework. You'd only be able to run that on .NET Core, and that freaked a whole bunch of people out. So I don't know what the resolution to that was, but if that impacts you, yeah, go. There's probably sessions at Build on .NET Core where there was Q&A sessions, so that'd probably be the first place I'd go. Is I'm sure somebody's asked that question. So probably the ones that have Scott Hanselman in it would be where I would be looking. So cool. That's it. Then thank you. Oh yeah. So yeah, that was also a .NET. Yes.
Or, I don't know
So as of the .NET, so as of Visual Studio 2017 RTMing a few months ago, they finished that for .NET Core. So .NET Core has this new simplified csproj, and the cool thing about that was you don't have to reference each individual file. You can just reference a folder, and it'll pick up everything in that that folder. So you don't have to have individual line items for files, which is awesome. But that's at the moment only for .NET Core projects. Other projects which are always csproj projects like Xamarin and Windows and stuff, they haven't changed at the moment, but I think they are bringing them all into line eventually. They're probably all on their own time frames. I heard UWP is moving, and I'm sure the rest will move eventually. But at the moment, that's just a .NET Core thing, because .NET Core was the only one that had moved over to the JSON format. So yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Let's bring it up. Cool.
So those, I'm looking at Xamarin.iOS and Android. Those are Xamarin versions, which is that right?
Yes.
That's Xamarin.iOS 10.
Yes.
Which still means that when we go to Xamarin.iOS 10,
Yeah. And there was a whole little discussion that's been going on about you might find it weird that there's like .NET Framework with tooling 1 and .NET Framework with tooling 2. There's a whole thing about how .NET 1.6 and .NET .NET Standard 1.5 supported .NET 6 4.6.2, but then they went and did a scan of like all the NuGet libraries and available and statistics and stuff, and figured out that most libraries supported 4.6.1, and there was only like 40 something APIs different. So they've gone back, and so the compatibility shim will work for 4.6.1, not for 4.6.2. But they said that impacts a tiny number of people, and the benefit outweighs the cost. So pretty much, if you're writing .NET Standard libraries at the moment, target them at 1.4, because if you target them at 1.5 and 1.6, it's a bit weird, because 2.0 will drops. Then it's not meant to do that, but it's kind of how it's going to work. But it's not a huge deal. 1.4 is it gives you Xamarin, it gives you UWP, it gives you pretty much everything. 4.6.1, it's great. So and then 2.0 when it comes out will be awesome, because you'll get all those new APIs. I think the bait and switch stuff will work the same. It's just I think you'll need to do it less, because there'll be a lot more scenarios that are just supported without doing it. I don't think the bait and switch needs to change if you are using something outside it. Yeah. Just yeah. There's working on it. Yeah. So they said later this year. So later this year. That's all they told us. So yeah. Anything else? It's funny. I like the Xamarin Forms one, because I think it's known that I haven't been the hugest Xamarin Forms fan. But this build has kind of turned me around on it a bit. I'm like, okay, it's probably because it's just maturing a lot, and I'm like, okay, when I see that they're like working to like do things like merge the XAML between UWP and Xamarin Forms, I'm like, okay, this is going to the next level. This is one of the things James Montemagno said was they are now feel that Xamarin Forms is good enough that they no longer are recommending it purely for line of business apps. They're recommending it for any apps now, if that's what you want. Whereas before it was very much a line of business app focused thing. So that was a big change around Xamarin Forms too, that they are ready to promote it to at that level. And I'm like, cool. The performance stuff, they seem to be really serious on the performance stuff, especially on Android. The live player stuff, I mean, that's probably, that was one of my favorite sessions, because I came away just being like, this is happening. I didn't talk too much about this, but I went to a Fluent design session. I enjoyed that as well, because just seeing, I mean, I'm a Windows Phone user. Some of the design stuff hasn't been consistent in the last 2 years, and just seeing like what they want things to look like, I'm like, sweet. Back to the days of Windows Phone where everything was very consistent. It was different, weirdly different to other platforms. If you come from iOS and Android, Windows Phone looked really weird. It was cool. It was consistent, but weird, I guess. Now it's going to look more familiar to it. Shares similarities to Google's material design, I guess, but consistency, I like it, and it looks cool. So that were the 2 sessions I really liked. Yeah. Cool. I've been talking for half an hour, so.